According to what Plato tells us in the Phaedo, change that happens from one opposite to another must also happen in the other direction. Death must not only come from life, but life must also come from death. In last week's discussion, a question was raised about other sorts of opposites. What about opposites like justice and injustice? Even if it's true that justice comes from injustice, even if society can become more just over time, does that necessarily mean that injustice must also come from justice? If we could establish a perfectly just society, then would the moral degeneration of that society ultimately be inevitable? In this video, we will consider these questions by contrasting the linear conception of progress more familiar to modern people with the cyclical understanding that was held by the ancients, an understanding that is known as anacyclosis. Plato believed that change between opposites must occur in both directions. If the processes of change from one opposite to another did not balance each other out, then everything would inevitably end up in the same static state without any change occurring. If sleep came from wakefulness, but wakefulness did not come from sleep, then eventually everyone would be asleep with no way of waking up again. Let's call this the bidirectional change principle. Plato applies this principle to life and death just like he does to sleep and wakefulness. If everything that partakes of life were to die and remain in that state, then in the end, everything would ultimately have to end up being dead. As Plato puts it, wouldn't that necessarily mean that all things would inevitably be absorbed in death? As a consequence of this, life and death must also follow each other in a cyclical fashion. Plato also illustrates this point with the examples of beauty and justice. If it isn't possible for only beauty to exist, then beauty and ugliness must also exist in a cyclical relationship. Finally, unless we think it is possible for every action and society to be perfectly just, then justice and injustice must follow one another such that perfect justice inevitably deteriorates into injustice. So, Plato assumes that it is impossible to only have dead things, only beautiful things, or only just things. But is this assumption correct? Let's focus on justice here. Plato seemingly must assume that it would be impossible for a society to persist in perfect justice. Now, certainly, every society has its share of injustice, and it does seem rather difficult to imagine the complete elimination of all injustice. But suppose for just a second that that state of perfection was actually reached. Why think that such a society would necessarily be doomed to fall back into injustice? Isn't living in a perpetually just society at least something that could be conceivably hoped for? The question we are confronted with here has to do with the nature of our progress toward a more just society. Do we progress toward justice in a linear fashion, or do we progress toward justice in a cyclical fashion? According to the linear view, history shows that we make gradual and perhaps frustratingly slow progress toward justice. There are steps backward and serious injustices along the way, but there's still a broad trend of just social arrangements that replace unjust social arrangements. On the linear view, it would be theoretically possible to arrive at a final endpoint in which perfect justice has been achieved and injustice defeated once and for all. This is not the case for the cyclical view. The cyclical view does believe that progress toward justice is possible. However, what distinguishes the cyclical view is the idea that even if perfect justice could be achieved, it could never persist. There's something about a just state of society that makes it inherently unstable and precarious. A state of peace and social harmony where all are treated fairly eventually must degenerate into injustice. The linear view of progress is one that is more familiar to modern people. Consider, for example, the following famous quote from Martin Luther King Jr. In his 1964 address at the commencement ceremony of Wesleyan University, in the middle of the civil rights struggle against racial segregation, King proclaimed that, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." The power of this statement comes from its aspirational quality. It points toward a future in which injustice is defeated, a moral victory can be claimed, and the battle finally put to rest. Furthermore, the statement also suggests inevitability. Progress requires human effort and struggle to overcome obstacles, but in the end, we can go forward confidently knowing that justice will prevail. Another example of the modern linear view can be seen in the work of contemporary political scientist Francis Fukuyama. In 1989, only months before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, Fukuyama claimed that we were witnessing the end of history as such, that is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. By the end of history, Fukuyama meant that we had finally settled on the best form of government, Western-style liberal democracy, which guarantees citizens the basic rights of self-government and self-determination. According to this view, history had ended in the sense that humanity had finally reached consensus on the ideal that will govern the material world in the long run. Fukuyama's proclamation also contains a sense of finality and inevitability. The establishment of liberal democracy is the end point of our shared destiny. This idea resonates closely with the linear view of history and moral progress. The human race had primitive beginnings, but our natural tendency towards civilization, equality, justice, order, and the rule of law have produced greater individual liberty, opportunity, and material prosperity. And provided we defend these pillars of civilization, then violence, conflict, and civil strife should really be relics of the past. We should have no reason to fear that our civilization would degenerate into ruin or anarchy. However, such optimism was not necessarily shared by ancient thinkers like Plato. In another of Plato's dialogues called The Republic, he defends a version of the cyclical view. This account relies upon a general principle about the stability of any political order. Because all created things must decay, then even the best social order cannot last of all time. Eventually it will decline. So, in contrast to Fukuyama's thesis, there is no political order that can put an end to human history. Every government inevitably deteriorates, and thus arises the need to build just social arrangements once again. Ancient political writers termed this process anacyclosis, the cycle of political regimes in which one form of government evolves or devolves into another. In the Republic, Plato describes a transition of this sort between 5 different forms of government. In Plato's view, the best form is aristocracy, which means rule by the best. However, there is also timarchy, oligarchy, democracy, and finally tyranny, which Plato believes is the most diseased form of government. The modern reader will certainly find it strange that Plato places democracy just above tyranny. However, for our purposes, what really matters here are Plato's thoughts on the relationship between these forms of government. Plato describes a process of anacyclosis through which aristocracy ultimately devolves into tyranny. Aristocracy devolves into timarchy, which then becomes oligarchy, which consequently degenerates into democracy, and that is a form of government that inevitably produces tyranny, which again Plato believes is the lowest and worst form of government. Plato does not explicitly describe how we return to aristocracy from tyranny. However, it does seem that this process should exist. Otherwise, just like everyone would be asleep if sleep did not return to wakefulness, so every regime would eventually be a tyranny without a return to aristocracy. It is important to recognize that Plato did not believe that this cycle of regimes was a haphazard process. There are specific identifiable reasons why, for example, democracy degenerates into tyranny. Explained very briefly, in a democratic regime, the people are given much more personal liberty. Eventually, however, this greater freedom brings about an uncontrolled and undisciplined anarchy for which the only remedy is a tyrant who can reinstitute order. Now, let's return to our initial question. Why does Plato believe that perfect justice inevitably degenerates into injustice? Why isn't moral progress sustainable in the long run? If we are talking about the just organization of society, and if society itself cycles through a series of regimes, then the just social arrangements cannot be permanent. No matter how far we progress toward justice, we must always start again. Again, this ancient view of circularity likely sounds foreign to the modern ear, but we should think seriously about this difference of perspective. What made the ancients more skeptical about the idea of stable, lasting moral progress? And what makes modern people more willing to entertain the possibility of an end of history? Why are we so much more optimistic about the final victory of justice?